I wanted to welcome everybody to week 4, I think we are starting. So in week 1, we just introduced ourselves. In week 2, we went over the kind of the beginnings of the United States government tradition and theory and policy in some ways. And then last week, we went over the Constitution, the body of the Constitution, and then the amendments. And so just to recap on that, this week we are covering federalism, which is the relationship between federal, state, and local governments, which makes up um, most of the government of the United States. And it's something our founding fathers wanted. They wanted there to be a difference in state power and a difference in federal power. Um, Originally, the tradition was states would have more power, states would be able to do more of the things that govern our everyday lives, and then the feds would be there for the big stuff, such as um, money and infrastructure, and of course, defense from foreign affairs. So I'm going to go over the PowerPoint for the week, do my little bit of a lecture, and uh, then there'll be a quiz and discussion question like normal. Um, and that's what my plan is to kind of do a little bit of a brief lecture via video, just to ground us in the material, and then, go from there. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Um, Says it does. So anyways, keep going. I just get so nervous. All right. Um, So, federalism, the relationship between federal, local, state, and federal governments. The first one I have here is the coronavirus or COVID. That was something that we all dealt with in a major way 6 years ago. And one of the reasons that it was such a disaster was because we did not have um, defined responsibilities in this area. We haven't had a major epidemic or pandemic like that really since the Spanish flu of 1918. We've had some that have come close. The H1N1 um, virus that went around in 2009 killed a number of people, but obviously coronavirus was was the biggest that we had seen, like I said, since 1918, almost 100 years or just over 100 years prior. Uh, so the issue with coronavirus was ultimately one of the things we're going to learn about is healthcare, how healthcare gets administered, who makes the rules for different healthcare issues. That lives at the state level for the most part. It's the state that decides what vaccines are mandatory for school. It's the state that decides, are you a doctor? A doctor doesn't get nationally certified. A doctor has to be certified by the state board. So it's actually each state. That's honestly why some states have really good health care and some states don't. Oklahoma. Excuse me. Um, and and so Trump came in 2020. He was president at the time, and he said that if you wanted tested, you could get tested. And this caused people who may or may not have been exposed to the virus to run out and get tests. Supplies were quickly depleted. And so we didn't have testing supplies. So this hit in March of 2020. They closed down the campus I was working on towards the end of that month. So I think by the beginning of April, we were working from home, and there was no way to get tested, and that was the issue. If you were sick, it didn't matter. There was no options in Wichita. to get tested. Finally, I want to say by the end of May, the state authorized a number of testing centers. Um, and it was like a drive-through where you went in, they swabbed you, and then you got the results later on. And but that, like I said, it took 2 months for the state to mobilize that. The issue with that is Trump said, you can get tested, we'll take care of you. So everybody went and got tested. And then when the states were like, hey, we don't have any testing supplies, the federal government was like, oh, well, that sucks to be you. Figure it out. And so that was the question is who had the responsibility? I think states thought that the feds, because they came out saying they were going to take care of things, thought the feds were going to take care of things, and the feds didn't, which is not the first time this has happened in American history for sure. Um, so federalism versus unitary power. If you were in a country with just unitary power, then there is no federal, state, and local relations. The feds handle everything. Um, Express powers to the national government, or explicit powers or extremely defined powers, which is what you're going to find in our Constitution, for our government. I mean, what they can do, what they have power over, is expressly listed in our document. And then, as we learned last week, the Ninth and Tenth Amendments reserve the rest of the powers essentially to the states. The rest of the rights and the powers are to the states and the people. Um, the original Constitution recognizes two governments, state and federal. Um, One of the great things about federalism is if we have these many different levels of government, it gives you more opportunity to participate. Most politicians start at the local level, work their way up to the state level, and then start having their eye on federal jobs. In the government currently, though things have changed throughout history, especially we'll talk about that, and it's there in the book, and this chapter covers the change in this relationship almost exclusively. State and local governments still have a significant amount of power in the US compared to other countries. Intergovernmental relations is a test question. It's the process by which those levels of government negotiate and compromise over policy responsibility. Um, some places or some entities, sometimes the federal government wants more power over a situation. Sometimes they don't want to be responsible and want to put the states in charge. Usually, if they put the states in charge, that means they don't want to pay for it. So they put the burden of the finance burden on the states. That's usually when the government gives up power, is when they don't want to pay for it. Um, and then we have the implied powers or the elastic clause. That is a fun little area in our Constitution that says that Congress can do whatever is necessary. Congress can pass whatever laws that are necessary and proper to achieve the goals of the rest, in order to do all of the things listed there in Article 1, tax policy, uh, copyright laws, banking, all of that, the right or the power to declare war, that all lives in Congress. Um, and the necessary and proper clause says that Congress can pass whatever law they need to in order to successfully complete their other responsibilities, basically. And then Article 6 defines federalism further by stating that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, that the Constitution supersedes state law, it supersedes state constitutions, that we all look back towards our Constitution for guidance. Powers of the state governments. We've talked, the Constitution goes over the power of the federal governments. It doesn't really go deeply over the powers of the state government. But this is where we've defined it through the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. They have the power to develop and enforce criminal codes, so the state has police power. Um, in fact, they're the ones that you're going to deal with if you've broken most laws. I like to to point out this, so murder. If you have murdered somebody, you are actually not, you haven't violated federal law. Um, you you have violated state law. So if you're not, uh, if you're from Oklahoma, I'm over here in the Panhandle region, and we last year this region was rocked by the murder of, and you hopefully should have heard about this. It made national news. There were two women that were on their way to a custody exchange. One was going to pick up her kids, and the other lady was a friend and a court-appointed supervisor for the meeting. And they were both murdered by the father of the children's mother and boyfriend and three other people that were involved. And I've been following this case closely because a lot of it does apply to the things I talk about. And so the murder of these women is not a federal crime. It's the state of Oklahoma that's going to be prosecuting these people for murder. Um, because ultimately it doesn't actually say in our Constitution that murder is a federal crime, that you can't kill people. In fact, the right to life is not listed in our Constitution. It's in the Declaration of Independence, which is not a legally binding document. What is talked about in our Constitution, though, is the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is if you have been held, that you have a right to see a judge about why you have been held. So habeas, hold, corpse, your body. Our founding fathers, it specifically dealt with your body. You are not supposed to be physically restrained um, without due process. And it doesn't matter who's doing it. So kidnapping means you're restraining somebody, you're stopping them from moving about the way that they had planned to move about. You are holding their corpse. Hopefully, it's not a corpse, because if it was, then it'd be murder along with kidnapping charges. But once you have kidnapping involved, that's a federal crime. Kidnapping is a federal crime and will be one of the first to get the feds involved. Um, Administer health and safety rules. So this has also been mostly up to the state. Like I mean, I could talk about lots of different things. In the state of Oklahoma, it's completely illegal to get an abortion. In Kansas, it's different. Um, it's harder than it used to be to get an abortion in Kansas, but Kansas has always kind of been strangely a place of that has been protected. Um, uh, we'll just touch on marijuana. The federal government just recently descheduled marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3. That does kind of decriminalize it a little bit. I'm not gonna, we'll go into more about that when it's relevant to the topic. But different states see marijuana differently. Some see it as a medicine and have medical marijuana. Some treat it like alcohol, where it's recreational. And then others treat it like it's heroin, and you can't have it at all without going to jail still today. And so it's different in every state. And it was the same with coronavirus. When uh, I was driving to Oklahoma quite a bit from Kansas, and there's a gas station on the other side of the Oklahoma line um, that I stopped in, and I remember taking off my mask, or not taking off my mask. I didn't have it when I was driving. But I remember reaching for the mask when I was going inside to go to the bathroom and be like, oh, I don't have to. I don't have to wear a mask when I go in public in Oklahoma. So there were differences. And I think there should be. When it came to coronavirus, Wichita, with its 600,000 people all driving around, touching stuff and all of that, it was a much bigger deal than things were, say, in my hometown of Kiowa, Kansas, where I think we had 5 total cases um, throughout the entire. I think we ended up having more after it, calmed down and got a little bit more widespread. Um, but it certainly wasn't as scary if you were working in the Wichita hospitals. And so um, I think there should be different rules. I think different areas should get to handle the virus as they see fit. Um, that's my opinion, though. Many people disagreed with me, and many people felt that those lax laws were the reasons that their loved one died because their loved ones contracted the virus and died. And so they aren't as cavalier about the lax laws in Oklahoma. Um, and so um, they regulate family. The state regulates family. So you get married in the state. If you get divorced through the state. You have to go through court and deal with all that. Licensing professionals, I already talked about doctors. Teachers have to get licensed in the state that they teach. Some states recognize out-of-state licenses, others don't. There is a national licensure for teachers, but not every state recognizes it, and many still make you get the state licensure as well as the national licensure. Um, they regulate the use and ownership of vehicles and build most of the roads that we drive on. Just talking about Kansas and Oklahoma again, you can tell or used to be able to tell the difference. It's been a long time since I've been on that road. Um, but you used to be able to tell the difference the moment you crossed the state line because on the Kansas side, it was usually a pretty decent road, and then once you got into Oklahoma, not so much. They don't spend as much on their upkeep as Kansas does. Um, and so a little bit on state powers. There are powers that both the state and federal government share. Both the state and federal governments can charter banks. Um, in fact, we have an issue going all the way back to one of the first Supreme Court cases. I think it's US v. Maryland. And the state of Maryland passes a law that says any state or any bank that isn't chartered by the state of Maryland has to pay a tax. And the only bank in the state of Maryland that wasn't chartered by the state of Maryland was a federally chartered bank. And the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Maryland can't pass taxes on a federally chartered bank. And so one of the first ones. They can grant or deny charters for corporations. Um, so the federal government can do this on a national scale. The states can do it on a state level. They both regulate the quality of products and labor conditions, though a lot of that has been taken over by the federal government. And then they can both levy taxes. That's probably the most important concurrent power. Out of your paycheck, you will have state and federal taxes and uh, taken from your paycheck. And so that is, like I said, it's some states have high sales tax, some don't. Um, some localities have a sales tax, so it's not just states. Local governments can also levy a tax, though usually in the form of a sales tax or property tax. Um, State relationships with each other. The full faith and credit clause says public acts, records, and judicial proceedings go state to state, privileges and immunities. So if you're allowed to do something in one state, you should be allowed to do it in another. Or if you're from another state, you're not prohibited from doing that because you're from another state. And so that's not always possible. And it's not necessarily 100% true. So if you are, and I'm going to go back to the medical, um, the the medical side. Not everything goes from state to state, and there are certain rights as far as medical care goes that you have in some states that you don't in others. Um, and that's part of the issue. If you guys there were with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that's a whole topic for another class. But with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the city of Amarillo was trying to pass a law that you married pregnant women couldn't leave the city. I'm not exactly sure how it didn't pass, but it was proposed, seriously proposed to the city council to pass a law that keeps pregnant women from leaving the city to seek an abortion. And so um, lots of different levels of power that we're dealing with. Um, the interracial and same-sex marriages. Marriage is a right that our Supreme Court has ruled goes back before the creation of the U.S. government itself, that there are certain rights to marriage and rights to privacy under your marriage that, like I said, go back before the Constitution was even founded. And we have the interracial marriage gets protected by several amendments as well as Supreme Court laws. Um, the 14th Amendment says that you can't be denied your civil rights because of your sex, race, um, color, or previous condition of servitude. Not sex, just race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Um, and um, and then the Defense of Marriage Act. Same-sex marriage gets protected by a Supreme Court decision with Hodges v. Obergefell, and then the Defense of Marriage gets passed by both houses that does protect same-sex marriage and requires all states to allow same-sex marriage to take place and to recognize those marriages. Um, which, when we talk more about civil rights and civil liberties, you will see how important it is that everybody, regardless of what differentiates you, everybody should have access to those civil rights and civil liberties. Because if one group doesn't have them, no group has them. But we'll talk more about that next week. Um, one example of this is you can't pass a law that favors the citizens of your state over citizens of another state. And an example I have for this is Alaska. So when oil was a took off in Alaska, it was a big boom there. Alaska tried to pass a law that gave state citizens, so citizens of Alaska, preferences for oil field jobs. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was illegal, that you can't hold private jobs for your citizens, that they have to be open to everyone. Um, this graphic right here talks about the many different governments that we have. So we've got one national government, 50 state governments, about 3,000 county governments, around 20,000 um 20 we'll go close to 40,000 townships and municipal governments, around 13,000 school districts which are a government, and then other special districts, um, which would be anybody that has a governing board of some kind. Um, Local governments are not mentioned in the Constitution. Their authority is defined by the state and local governments. Um, and there's a concept here called home rule. And this is the idea that large cities can kind of operate without state or national interference. Um, New York, largely New York City, um, runs almost on its own. New York State just collects the tax dividends. Um, and one thing I've noticed is ICE ICE in New York hasn't made the same levels of news that ICE in Chicago and ICE in Minneapolis have. Um, and I'm going to look in to see why that is, why ICE is not in New York, um, or at least doesn't have much of a media presence there. Um, so this has shifted a little bit as far as federalism goes. Our framework itself has survived 2 centuries in a civil war, almost 2.5 centuries. And so it is a problem. It isn't perfect. Um, but as I mentioned in my other class, we may not love our current system of government. I'm not going to say great things about it all the time. But it is a system of government that has lasted for 250 years. And the names have changed, the ideals have changed, the political parties have changed, but the overall system itself has more or less remained sound. And that is actually something to be proud of. And while I don't love everything about our current system of government, I'd rather have it than some of the other options that we have for large population, large territory, first world countries. Um, and so we're not perfect. I truly believe if we all work together to continue to uphold civil rights and civil liberties and follow the things that are listed there in our Constitution, that as a nation we can overcome anything or anyone. Um, the Supreme Court, so over time, in the beginning, our founding fathers were suspicious of federal government. They were suspicious of federal power. The state enjoyed the most power over the citizens' lives. That is still, I would say, the norm today. Overall, the things that I do are regulated more by the state than the federal government. But the Supreme Court has limited things over time in a big way. We don't really see like they continue to limit government, especially after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment basically gets gutted. We'll talk a little bit more about that throughout this class. But the 14th Amendment is supposed to apply the Bill of Rights to state governments. The 14th Amendment establishes your birth citizenship and says that privileges and immunities are yours regardless of race. And there's a Supreme Court ruling, the Slaughterhouse cases in 1873, that basically gut the 14th Amendment and interpret it in a way that we can't just assume that everybody has the same civil liberties and civil rights, that each right in the Constitution has to be incorporated against the states by a Supreme Court case. And so we'll talk a lot about those as we go through this class. The Great Depression changes the Federalist relationship. Um, Franklin Roosevelt assumes a significant amount of power, and um, because it has to. We've got people starving, we've got people out of work. The government has a job there in the preamble to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And so it has had a responsibility. So that expands the power of the federal government in a huge way. And then with 9/11, with the Patriot Act, the federal government can now spy on us and our online activity for no reason. The Great Recession hits, and we start seeing the government take over more finance related issues. And then, of course, coronavirus. That was the big question. Who's the one that decides what we can and can't do? Who's the one that decides what we do in the time of crisis? Um, and so I'm going to define these two terms here, and then that's where I'm going to end the video. Dual federalism is the traditional system that we had, that I would say we had up until um, the Great Depression and World War II and the Cold War. It changes our federalism. Um, and so with the dual federalism, the national government was fairly small, only provided certain functions. The feds assisted with commerce and building roads. They dealt with tariffs on imported goods, so they were in charge of the global trade and economy. They provided land or capital needed for economic development. They weren't directly concerned with citizens. In fact, one example of this is the Texas Seed Bill, 1883. Uh, Garfield, not Garfield, Cleveland, Grover Cleveland vetoes the Texas Seed Bill. And this bill was to give farmers in Texas that had been dealing with drought some money to buy seed and equipment to get them back on the ground or get them back up on their feet and get um, that industry in Texas going again. The bill passes both the House and the Senate. It gets up to Grover Cleveland, who vetoes it. If you guys don't know already, the president can veto laws, and he has that final say. And he did that because this is his quote, that the federal government was not responsible for the suffering of individuals. That was beyond the power of the federal government, that was a state and local issue. And obviously people disagreed, but he had the final say. I talked about McCulloch v. Maryland, not US v. Maryland, but that is where Maryland can't impose taxes on banks. Um, Gibbons v. Ogden gives the federal government power over all interstate commerce, so all waterways and then eventually highways. Um, and this kind of it keeps the federal government out of things like product quality fraud, child labor, and working conditions. And so um, it allows the federal government to promote industry, but there is no protection from the federal government for the worker or for the consumer. So when I like to say it allows business owners to have their cake and eat it too. Um, the Great Depression brings change. I'll let you guys read that slide or read about it in the book. But this is really where I wanted to kind of show you this graphic here. The layer cake or dual federalism versus the marble cake or cooperative federalism, where the state and the federal governments share responsibility. And then the concept of devolution, that's giving power back to the states. This is a Nixon-Reagan thing. It gave block grants instead of specific grants to states in order to take care of things. Um, One of the issues is it had significant funding cuts. And so I do want to talk about unfunded mandates. So they're unfun. Um, this would be things like wheelchair access. So while you are required to upgrade, states are required to upgrade businesses for wheelchair access, there's not a lot of money. You're expected to cover that cost yourself. And so it's a mandate with no money. And you want money. You want the federal government. If they're going to make you do something, you want them to help you pay for it. But it doesn't happen with unfunded mandates. Uh, all right. So that's where I'm going to leave that. Hope that was somewhat informative or a review for some of you if you already know this. If you have any questions or issues, please let me know. I'm going to get the quiz up today as well as the discussion question. And so just let me know if you ever want to have a discussion about any topic one-on-one. We can set up a time or we can do it in the chat. It's totally up to you. But yeah, we'll just keep plugging along. So like I said, this week we're covering federalism. I believe that is chapter 3 in the book, chapter 3 or 4. Um, I can't look right now, but I will make sure that the link is posted in the module as well. But yeah, get that chapter read, get this video watched, and a couple others that I post, and have a good understanding of the relationship between our local, state, and federal relations. It's a lot more in depth and a lot more nuanced than what you kind of get taught in school. Not everybody wants power. Like a lot of times, we're not arguing over who gets the power over something. We're arguing over who has the financial or um, even just managerial responsibility over an issue. Because I used to think I wanted, I'm a uh, public sector worker. Um, I'm a public administrator, and I used to want responsibility and power. And now I have too much. Now I want to give some of it away. And so, um, thinking that the government is always wanting to be involved in everything, that's not necessarily the case. Being involved in everything takes money and manpower, and our governments aren't just rolling in the dough right now. And so it's an issue. Um, the one thing I will touch on is there's some things that I personally believe are happening right now that are violations of our federalist system. I mentioned home rule. Uh, Major cities like Chicago and Minneapolis, and I did mention New York, um, do operate without a lot of federal oversight. And so the idea that the federal government can set in a federal agency that somehow has power that supersedes the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, um, as well as the First and the Second, that's alarming to me. Because our state constitutions were largely modeled after our federal constitutions. Like what ICE is doing, in my opinion, is a violation of our Constitution, and it's a violation of our tradition of federalism, where states have the authority to do what they need to do. They're the ones that run people's daily lives. They're the ones that decide whether an immigrant can or cannot reside in their state. I mean, it's Minneapolis that allows this asylum. And so I really struggle with that. And a 5-year-old without a criminal record at all. Why is that why is that, why is he being detained? And so that's like I said, it's a question. Um, the governor of Minneapolis called in the National Guard uh, to protect their citizens from the federal government. And so it's a cluster, it's a mess. It's a problem. Um, and I hope if anybody watched the Grammys last night, it was an issue. People had ice out pins. People talked about it. And it will continue to be an issue as we move forward. And so that's where I'm going to leave you. I hope you've gotten something out of this lecture. I hope you enjoy your week. If you need anything from me, please let me know.